What does it mean to imagine something? When we conjure a thought out of the stillness of awareness, we necessarily recognize it as something separate from ourselves. But does it truly exist? And if it does, in what sense? Is it too literal to ask these questions? Are the answers painfully obvious or too obscure to even touch? Before you decide, consider the following account from Dion Fortune, one of the most respected esotericists of the 20th century. A trained psychotherapist turned ceremonial magician, she claimed to have accidentally created a spectral monster of mythic proportions. At the time, she explains,
I had received serious injury from someone whom, at considerable cost to myself, I had disinterestedly helped, and I was sorely tempted to retaliate. Lying on my bed, resting one afternoon, while brooding over my resentment, I drifted toward the borders of sleep. There came to my mind the thought of casting off all restraints and going berserk. The ancient Nordic myths rose before me, and I thought of Fenris, the wolf horror of the north. I immediately felt a curious drawing out sensation from my solar plexus, and there materialized beside me on the bed a large wolf. It was a well-materialized ectoplasmic form, gray and colorless. I could distinctly feel its back pressing against me as it lay beside me. I was horrified at what I had done and knew I was in a tight corner and that everything depended on my keeping my head. I had enough experience of practical occultism to know it could be controlled by my will, but that if I lost my nerve, I would have a Frankenstein monster to cope with. I stirred slightly, and the creature evidently objected to being disturbed, for it turned its long snout towards me over its shoulder and snarled, showing its teeth. I drove my elbow into its hairy ribs and said, "If you can't behave yourself, you'll have to go on the floor," and pushed it off the bed. Down it went, meek as a lamb, and changed from a wolf to a dog, to my great relief. Then the northern corner of the room appeared to fade away, and the creature went out through the gap.
The fact that something truly strange had happened was corroborated by her roommate, who reported having nightmares of wolves and awoke in the night to see eyeshine in the corner of her room. In this episode, we're going to zero in on what may be the most pervasive phenomenon of the astral realm, one that is essential to unlocking its deepest mysteries, the thought form. An entity that rises from the depths of our own minds to take on a life of its own, far greater and far stranger than anything we could imagine. Welcome to the Hidden Passage. Theosophist Arthur E. Powell states that, quote, "The elemental essence which surrounds us on every side is in all its numberless varieties singularly susceptible to the influence of human thought. The action of a mere casual, wandering thought upon it, causing it to burst into a cloud of rapidly moving, evanescent forms. Thought seizes upon the plastic essence and molds it instantly into a living being of appropriate form, a being which, when once thus created, is in no way under the control of its maker, but lives out a life of its own, of intense activity animated by the one idea that generated them. The concept of the thought form was largely introduced to modern society through the work of early 20th century French explorer Alexandre David Niel, who traveled to Tibet to study and practice Buddhist mysticism in the remote monastic communities of the Himalayas. There she learned from the spiritual adepts known as the lamas about the thought form, which they referred to as the tulpa, roughly translating to manifestation. In her several years of intensive training and meditation in isolated caves, she attempted to create her own tulpa. She was given an intensive set of procedures, and as part of them, she was to visualize a form and concentrate on it for long periods of time. She chose to imagine a heavy-set, jolly monk, and slowly over time it began to take shape in front of her, first as a faint outline, and gradually becoming more defined, until allegedly it could actually be seen by other people in the community. It became lifelike and solid enough that sometimes she could feel the brush of his robe as he passed by, or even the touch of his hand. But the experiment took a dark turn. As more people acknowledged its existence, it evidently gained more agency, and as it did so, grew increasingly hostile. It was now no longer under her control and could manifest wherever and whenever it wished. Its appearance grew deformed, and it bore a menacing smirk. And eventually she was forced to destroy what she called the, quote, day nightmare, a difficult 6-month-long process as the being had become, quote, tenacious at life. This might seem like a rare, isolated occurrence, and it's true that a thought form with that level of materiality, if at all possible, would require considerable practice and knowledge of the occult. Creating thought forms intentionally is indeed a common practice among magical practitioners. Dion Fortune writes that this process involves, quote, forming a clear-cut image in the imagination of the creature that it is intended to create, and souling it with something of the corresponding aspect of one's own being, and then invoking into it the appropriate natural force. But according to theosophists like Annie Besant, thought forms are constantly being created by all thinking beings, often unintentionally, without a person ever realizing it. Thought forms are said to be so common that they make up a majority of the fauna of the astral plane. In fact, all the phenomena in the stories we've heard throughout this series, in some sense, fall into this category. Most of these are said to be ephemeral and dissipate without having any real effect. But a great many of them may become quasi-permanent conscious beings whose power and lifespan are proportional to two main factors: the depth of emotional force and focused intent of its creator, and any repetition of thought which may occur after it. A thought form can take the shape of anything from a nebulous cloud-like mass to a definite and detailed form. Especially if one was visualized, any attempt to categorize or classify them is completely impossible. They are as diverse in form and nature as human thoughts themselves. So, what happens after a thought form is created? Well, according to Theosophy, this type of artificial entity has a kind of survival instinct which causes it to seek out energies similar to itself, whether it gets that from the person who created it or from something else. If it can glean it from its creator, it will linger around them, as long as that person continues to generate similar thoughts and may work to evoke those thoughts within them. This is interesting, maybe a little disconcerting when we think about the habits that we form, which can become very hard to break. The idea that our thoughts can get away from us by becoming these entities that impel us to stay with these patterns because it reinforces their own existence. And as a result, we're caught up in this vicious cycle. It may go towards explaining some of this cognitive dissonance where we end up thinking and doing things we no longer resonate with despite having outgrown them. The scope and influence of thought forms are by no means limited to the auric fields of their creators. Besant attributes their ability to travel to the radiating power of thought. We can find many hints of this force at play in folklore and the study of high strangeness. Things like in Native American culture, how people are warned not to think about skinwalkers or say the name skinwalker out loud, or else the skinwalkers will come for you. I've heard other stories where a person becomes so obsessed with a certain paranormal entity that it actually seeks them out and starts haunting them. Now, with respect to thought forms, if it is directed at another person, it will seek them out. With no specific target, it may float idly through the astral until either dissipating or is drawn toward another entity. Depending on its reserve of energy, it may be able to cover great distances to achieve its goal. So it's entirely possible for a person, if sharing enough common resonance, to come under the influence of a thought form that they technically had nothing to do with, but just happened to be in its vicinity. And if a person is emotionally charged, then corresponding thought forms can be magnetically pulled toward them. There are several ways in which thought forms can propagate, and all of them have to do with what's known as the law of vibrational resonance. This is considered to be the most fundamental force of the astral, like gravity is to the physical, dictating how everything organizes and moves through it. One of the first references to this can be found in the writings of 5th century Neoplatonic philosopher Proclus, who wrote that, quote, similarity is powerful enough to attach beings to one another. The idea is basically that everything has a vibrational frequency which attracts those similar to itself and repels those with opposing frequencies. Even things that are seemingly unrelated can and do interact in this way. Our inner life radiates out into the subtle planes, acting as both a receiver and a transmitter. In the astral realm, this force can move mountains, so to speak, with immediate impact, but its effects on the physical are more subtle and pan out over the long term. Nonetheless, its influence is pervasive. As Rudolf Steiner writes, quote, every soul possesses within it powers to make the surrounding world either a heaven or a hell, according to its own inner state. It really makes you think about what you're thinking about and what influences you want to surround yourself with. The principle of resonance applies to the cosmos at large. As Manly Hall writes, quote, through sympathy and antipathy, worlds and planes of consciousness intermingle, vibrating in and out of each other according to the laws of mutual attraction and repulsion, each sustaining in the order of nature. These forces set up what are referred to as astral currents, streams of energy that connect different areas of the cosmos, causing a tremendous force of movement that can pull things into it and sweep them along like a river. As Powell states, quote, on the astral plane, there are many currents which tend to carry about persons who are lacking in will, and even those who have will but don't know how to use it. I think these are probably what were referred to as spirit paths by the ancients. There are larger currents running across the earth, as well as astrological currents connecting through space, and there are also smaller currents circulating through our own astral bodies and branching outward through patterns of thought and emotion. And each of us has not one vibrational frequency, but many. Though it's common parlance today to talk about raising your frequency in the singular, but earlier thinkers had terms like the mystic chord, as in musical chord, of 3 or more harmonic tones, which together create your unique energetic signature. So to speak in terms of simple attraction and repulsion is really far too simplistic. Both are happening in varying degrees at many levels within and without. The ability of a thought form to travel along these various channels can have a positive or negative effect, depending on the nature of the thoughts involved. Unfortunately, since we are so often prone to negative thoughts, a majority of thought forms are probably detrimental. Compounding this, explains Ledbetter, is the fact that most people are unaware of the power that they have, mistakenly believing that they can harbor all the ill will they want to. As long as they don't act it out, there's no harm done, when in truth, they are effectively sending a curse, the evil eye. It's said that thought forms can not only precipitate negative psychic effects, but also even affect nature itself by causing things like natural disasters. On the surface, this might seem like the makings of an unfair, chaotic system, rendering us vulnerable to all kinds of unseen threats. But just as readily as antipathy may spread upon the world, so too can feelings of empathy and affection. As Besant writes, a thought of love and of desire to protect, directed strongly toward some beloved subject, creates a form which goes to it and remains in its aura as a shielding and protecting agent. It will seek all opportunities to serve and to defend. It will strengthen friendly forces that impinge on the aura and weaken unfriendly ones. Thus, we may create and maintain veritable guardian angels round those we love, and many a mother's prayer for a distant child thus circles round him, though she knows not the method by which her prayer is answered. We can also look to things like the Maharishi effect, where group meditations and prayer were recorded to have decreased crime rates in the surrounding areas. Whatever the balance may be between good and evil thought forms, there are supposedly certain mechanisms that act as a safeguard. As Ledbetter writes that a thought form, quote, can produce no effect upon a person toward whom it is directed unless he has himself some tendency which it can foster. From the aura of a man of pure thought and good life, all such influences at once rebound, finding nothing upon which they can fasten. And in that case, by a very curious law, they react in all their force upon their original creator. He goes on to suggest that thought forms are actually an integral part of the cosmic system. We might think of karma as a kind of mechanical, impersonal force, but it actually is mainly worked out through the web of consciousness that thought forms create. They're often the ones pulling the levers in our lives. Moreover, it's not total helter-skelter, as all thought forms, along with all astral beings, are supposedly under the control of greater beings. These are widely known as the four kings. In the Bible, the seraphim, the great protectors of mankind, stationed at the four ends of the earth, each assigned to their respective element. These beings, as well as the devas of the higher mental plane, may occasionally manifest in the astral, creating temporary astral bodies. These authors also refer to these hidden orders of evolution that normally don't interact with our realms at all, as well as beings from other solar systems, which sometimes cross over into the astral realm. They're very cagey on the details, and that's something that we'll try to investigate further down the line. Just know that that is on the table for beings that may be encountered in our astral plane. For example, there's countless stories of the alien Greys being encountered in a non-physical form. In every actual experience, the total surrounding world is not a world that is purely for me, but it is also a world for others. The world is necessarily the common, intersubjective world. Edmund Husserl. To really understand the significance of thought forms in the world, we need to take the bird's eye view and consider their influence on a macrocosmic level. If a thought form manages to move beyond the level of interpersonal relationships and break out into a wider sphere of influence, it has the potential to cause a net effect that exceeds its source. The more strength a thought form gains, tapping the world for mental energy, the farther its reach and power to influence becomes. As Ledbetter writes, quote, "Thought forms of a similar nature have a tendency to aggregate together and form a kind of collective entity. We see everything through this atmosphere. Every thought is more or less refracted by it, and our own astral bodies are vibrating in accord with it. As most people are receptive rather than initiative in their nature, they act almost as automatic reproducers of the thoughts which reach them, and thus the national atmosphere is continually intensified. This fact obviously explains many of the phenomena of crowd consciousness." If this is true, just imagine the potential in a world where millions of people can now instantly focus on one idea through the internet. We've already seen this play out. Paranormal researchers like Nick Redfern have written about how creepypasta fictional entities, like Slenderman, end up manifesting and being experienced by many people. His book, The Slenderman Mysteries, is full of pretty intense encounters with this thing. I'm sure many of you are aware of the case in Ohio where two girls tried to murder their friend for Slenderman, and it later came out in investigations that the girls actually believed he was real and that he spoke telepathically to them, basically demanding a sacrifice, and that they were afraid of what he would do if they didn't perform. The courts were lenient in their sentencing because they were convinced that the girls truly believed in these delusions. Around the same time, there were also other violent crimes carried out by people who had become obsessed with Slenderman. It seems that this thought form was tenacious at life, and it's eerily similar to what Ledbetter said about entities soliciting offerings and sacrifices to gain power, in a sense to become more real, which is what the thought form seeks to do. And while the potential seems far greater now with social media virality, at the same time it's counterbalanced because it's changed the way we interact, respond to, and wield these forces. For one thing, our attention spans have gotten short, which in cases like Slenderman might actually be a good thing. But also coinciding with this mass expansion of the media landscape is the breakdown of a consensus reality. So many voices, images, and ideas floating around that none are able to establish permanence or preeminence. We see these rapid vacillations of thought forms akin to the elemental realm. What this means, I have no idea, other than something like more chaos, but also more potential as this space is opened up to the collective. The process accelerates, and we have yet to really see or understand how this will affect us in the long run. I'll expand on that another time when I start my Substack, but my thesis with this is that it's as if the subtle realms are actually being manifested into the physical, or at least facsimilized through technoculture. When emotions and thoughts are shared by groups over time through generations of people, thought forms can become powerful forces, vitalized and sustained by the collective energy of everyone who gives them attention. This continual source of nourishment prolongs its lifespan indefinitely. Due to this phenomenon, Powell suggests that some lesser gods were actually thought forms essentially born out of a desire for some supernatural aid. If not created by emotional impulses, entities are certainly strengthened by them. This is eerily similar to what we just saw with the Slenderman cases. Remember that the astral is a link in the chain that everything has to pass through to manifest, which is why emotional resonance is such an important road opener, so to speak. This tracks with the folkloric trope of supernatural beings diminishing in power when abandoned by their followers. A case in point being the Tuatha De Danann, who in some interpretations are said to have shrunk in size, becoming the fairies after the conversion of Celtic peoples to Christianity. This theme still shows up in modern culture, like in movies where Santa Claus loses his power once people stop believing in him. And while some gods may fade into obscurity, others are conjured up. I'm reminded of the series American Gods, where there are these new deities coming into being that are anthropomorphic manifestations of the current cultural zeitgeist, gods of advertising and consumerism. Of course, many of these are old forces simply finding new outlets. Same players, different game. So, mass cultural developments often create the most powerful thought forms. Occultists have long discussed the concept of egregores, collective thought forms created by the focused attention of a group. People like Eliphas Levi and later Rosicrucian and Hermetic thinkers all touched on how these entities take on a semi-autonomous life, fueled by belief, ritual, and emotional resonance. An egregore isn't just a shared symbol, it's a kind of group mind made real. Art is particularly potent here because it produces these impactful characters. It has more emotional weight and also draws from older mythological archetypes. Invoking an archetype into a thought form, whether explicitly or implicitly, is perhaps the most effective way to vitalize it, as we saw in Fortune's case. An example of this in plain sight might be instances in which method actors end up with psychological issues from playing certain characters. We've all heard the rumors surrounding the Joker, how it took its toll on Heath Ledger. Whatever the truth behind it might be, I think there's definitely something to it. In the case of the Joker, he's akin to the trickster god of destruction. So it's like linking together a chain of correspondence. The character is possessed by the archetype, which then possesses the actor. It's not dissimilar to the invocation rituals where a person would mimic a deity's actions or attributes to put the two into communion, and thereby they channel their essence or power. The god then speaks or acts using them as a vessel. For every behavior, for every pattern, there is a being that embodies and presides over it. So as long as we exist, we are constantly corresponding to something. All of this is to say that the business of creating thought forms is by no means limited to occult practitioners. Let's hear a quick story from @2009 Lucky Star. When I was 9 years old, one evening I was sitting on my bunk bed and looking out into the night sky through my window. Back then, we were living in a third-floor apartment. It was a moonlit night, and I had a clear view of the sky. Suddenly, I saw a witch flying on a broomstick. Later that day, I drew a picture of it for a competition at school, and I won. My teachers were impressed with the detail. However, I didn't tell them that it was based on something I'd actually seen, of course, because I knew they wouldn't believe me. As an adult, I'm not sure if I believe it myself. I'm sensitive to the supernatural, but I'm 99% sure witches are just people. They don't have the ability to fly. Still, I saw what I saw. The broom-riding witch is a great example of an archetypal image that's been ingrained in our consciousness. If we think about the psychic environment in which it was formed during the witch trial hysteria of the Middle Ages, it's easy to see how a thought form could be created as a vessel into which all of the fear of the time was poured, and then surviving into modern day as one of our Halloween spooks. Now, I don't mean to say that the idea was purely an invention of the church. We've talked about how there are real historical roots to this, but I think it's an interesting angle to consider. I'm sure many listeners will be aware of all kinds of paranormal sightings of quote-unquote fictional characters, apparitions taking on these strangely stereotypical, recognizable appearances. For example, there have actually been sightings of Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. I've even heard one from the guys over at Expanded Perspectives where someone said they saw the Michelin Man. So what the hell is going on here? If we're working with this theosophical worldview, we would explain this by saying that all of these things actually exist as astral thought forms. Seems as good an explanation as any. Powell writes that, quote, "There are in the mental and astral worlds many renderings of well-known stories, each nation usually having its special presentation. Thus, there exists excellent and lifelike thought forms of people like Sherlock Holmes, Captain Kettle, Robinson Crusoe, Shakespeare's characters, etc. In fact, there are on the astral plane vast numbers of thought forms of a comparatively permanent character, often the result of the cumulative work of generations of people." Nick Redfern refers to an occultist who, quote, "succeeded in calling forth the persona of multiple types of famous cartoon characters." He states, quote, "Given a cartoon character as the popular idol of the time, it seemed an appropriate avenue to pursue. After all, things only have the power we give them. The success of summoning and interacting with the likes of Bugs Bunny, Roger Rabbit, and Pikachu were nothing short of bizarre." All of this talk of cartoons reminded me of a comment by @Melik411. She writes, quote, "I dream in a lucid way every single time. I travel to different places through water. I never remember the swim just coming up out of the water into a strange place with strange beings. Many times it's a place like Gumby. Everything is made up of what Gumby is made of. Anyone familiar with this?" So I can say that in some of my own projections, I've actually encountered things that appear as cartoon characters that I can recognize from TV shows. And definitely some stuff that looked like claymation too. I mean, you name it. It really does run the gamut. What's weird is that in my normal dreams, I don't usually see things like that. So take that how you will. Where it gets even stranger is the fact that these cartoon-like entities aren't always relegated to altered states of consciousness, making it a bit harder to write off as psychological, like in the case of our next experiencer, Elizabeth Poss.
Late one night, I was going up to get something at the 24-hour gas station. On the left was a lightly wooded, mostly empty lot, except for a storage building that had a light on it. I was crossing the tracks toward the road when I saw something move in the lot. There are some tweakers around these parts, and it looked like a person, so I stopped and stood there. After a bit, I could see something moving behind one of the trees. Arms like a human. Then it stepped out from behind the tree. It looked like a werewolf, but like one from a cartoon or a video game, like the one from Night Stalkers, but completely black and void of any detail. It proceeded to do the most Scooby-Doo villain sneak I have ever seen. It was so cartoonish that it wasn't even scary. I could see it moving behind the tree, so I shouted, "I see you." All motion stopped. I crossed the tracks and looked around the lot, which was well lit from the storage building, but nothing was there. For a while, we lived in the house across the lot from that road, and one across the tracks. Both places, my kids complained of seeing dark figures moving around there at night.
My immediate sense here is that whatever this entity was just using a thought form to help it manifest. While many entities naturally have the ability to shapeshift, the thought form offers the advantage of a concrete structure and stable vehicle that requires less energy to hold. Maybe the entity knew she could see it the whole time and played out this little drama in an overtly recognizable way to draw from her energy. Now, we could also say that some of these fictional characters are based on things that people have seen. For instance, the prolific occultist and successor to Crowley as the head of the OTO, Kenneth Grant, believed that the creatures and places in H.P. Lovecraft's novels were actually based in reality, on some other plane of existence, and that rather than having imagined them, he had actually perceived them psychically. On a final note here, many of these encounters follow this same kind of progression, where as soon as the being knows that it's been spotted, it disappears. One reason for this could be that because it's being startled, its concentration is broken, and this causes it to lose control of the form. Astral projectors will know it takes a great deal of focus and emotional stability to project, and maybe apparitions are doing something similar, essentially projecting into our world. Some elements of this could have to do with the process of creating a thought form, which sometimes is the body itself. One point that we can explore further is the idea that thought forms that we create can be adopted by outside entities. Many artists and writers often experience their characters almost taking on a life of their own. Creating strong characters is the most important task in writing a story. Once they've been established, authors will often feel as though crafting a plot is simply observing what the characters do. And in that sense, the story almost writes itself because these characters are kind of leading the way. It's fascinating to consider that there may be something more going on here than simply imaginative whimsy. As Powell writes, quote, "A curious effect arises in such a case. A playful nature spirit may ensoul the image and cause them to do things other than those which the author intended them to do." Any astral being, whether it be human or non-human, may ensoul a thought form in this way. a phenomenon which we can actually find some evidence of if we know where to look and if we're willing to entertain alternative interpretations of the data. One such place may be in the work of clinical psychologist Wilson Van Dusen, who worked at the Mendocino State Hospital, treating people with schizophrenia by actually holding discourse with the, quote, hallucinatory beings haunting his patients, the patients acting as their translators. He found that these seemed to function as separate intelligences, independent of the person who was experiencing them. The patients who were schizophrenic were not psychotic. They're just having non-ordinary perceptions. This is a fallacy that a lot of people still hold about schizophrenia. He wrote of the hallucinations, quote, "Some familiar ones come around day after day, such as one old codger called the old-timer. Hallucinations don't have names, personal histories, or identities as we think of them. Often they will accept and adopt any appropriate name given to them, such as the folksy old-timer, if it will please or beguile the listener. They make one up and discard it a short while later." He also noted that several patients were interacting with what appeared as the same figure of Jesus, but each one had a completely unique personality, sometimes radically contradictory to one another. It seems that the astral acts as a repository of these thought form templates. Don Juan said that at the edges of human perception, there is, quote, "a strange storage of refuse, an incalculable pile of human junk." For entities, it's almost like they have a wardrobe of different skins at their disposal that they can just apply at will, which malevolent beings seem especially fond of. A recent case that stood out to me was a Michigan woman who had killed her daughter because SpongeBob told her to. The show was playing on her TV during the incident, so maybe it became a kind of access point, the path of least resistance for some entity exploiting the resonance built up around this thought form. Apparently, this woman was going through drug withdrawal at the time, and one of her family members stated that she had actually passed out in a graveyard of all places shortly before committing this heinous act. The automatic writing is really on the wall here. So the only real mystery is, why would you go along with anything that tells you to do that? Least of all, fucking SpongeBob. I guess it's a sign of the times. In a former age, people had Abraham and Isaac, and I guess we have this. Anyway, we can trace this theme of errant manifestations of thought all the way to cosmogenic mystical beliefs. In the Kabbalah tradition, many of the demons were described as incomplete remnants of creational energy that could not be contained and integrated into form, believed to have originated during the outpouring of divine energy which first created the cosmos. But the surge was so strong that it caused a kind of imbalance in the process, and they were formed out of this event, known as the shattering of the vessels. So there's this disunity going on between the impulse and the form. A similar theme is found in the Gnostic belief in the divine Sophia, who, in a bid to know the unknowable, unintentionally created the abomination, Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, ruler of the material universe, and she did this with the power of her thought. As above, so below, virtually all ghosts and evil spirits are believed to be creations of misplaced human energy, thought forms, the effects of which may be disastrous. David Neal writes, quote, "Once a tulpa is endowed with enough vitality to be capable of playing the part of a real being, it tends to free itself from its maker's control. This, say the Tibetan occultists, happens nearly mechanically, just as a child, when his body is completed and is able to live apart, leaves its mother's womb. Sometimes the phantom becomes a rebellious son, and one hears of uncanny struggles that have taken place between the magicians and their creatures, the former being severely hurt or even killed by the latter. I think Joker 2 was actually a great metaphor for how these things can break away from their creator and permutate. The main character, Arthur, creates the thought form that is the Joker, which becomes something very different than what he had intended, something he no longer has control of, which is claimed by another force, and fittingly, it destroys him as a result. So it's a poignant rendition of how these things might actually play out in the real world. So, in conclusion, we've talked a lot about the connection between the mind and the supernatural. And I really like this way of thinking about it because it recognizes its relationship without negating one or the other. All of these crossovers between sociology, psychology, and the supernatural is one of the reasons why what may be real forces beyond our current understanding can easily be written off and intellectualized by skeptics. But everything we've covered here suggests that we have an active role in influencing and shaping these forces, which in turn respond to us. Perhaps the astral, as an intelligent system, interfaces with our thoughts and our subconscious so deeply that they're conflated as one and the same. Anyone who practices any form of transcendental meditation knows that the lines are blurred, and yet they are there. There's always just enough of a hint somewhere on the other side of the dark glass that there is another intelligence at work. The astral is like a buffer, a space in which the inner is negotiated with the outer, reflecting both. So if this plane of existence is real and operates in this way, we would expect that sometimes aspects of ourselves and things we imagine would manifest to us. But that in itself doesn't prove that it's all just going on in our heads. Maybe we need to reevaluate what imagination itself even is. Yes, it's all mental and symbolic and all of that. And yes, it's also transcendent. So yeah, it's tricky, but it can be reconciled. And when it is, it will open up a lot more avenues of exploration and understanding when we take a more holistic approach. This has been one of my greatest personal realizations since I've gotten into this whole thing. Whatever the truth may be, I think it benefits us to think of emotions and thoughts as powerful forces that can have transformative, potentially cascading effects in our lives and in the world at large. That every consciousness is participating in a shared constructed reality in which we are all connected and influencing one another. I think we all recognize on some level that how we feel about and preconceive the world conditions our experience of it. And perhaps experience, after all, is the most real thing there is.
When you observe the world, you see people, you see houses, you see the sky, you see tangible objects. But when you observe yourself within, you see moving images, a world of images, generally known as fantasies. Yet these fantasies are facts. It is a fact that a man has such and such a fantasy. And it is such a tangible fact, for instance, that when a man has a certain fantasy, another man may lose his life. Or a bridge is built. These houses were all fantasies. Everything you do here, all of the houses, everything was fantasy to begin with. And fantasy has a proper reality. That is not to be forgotten. Fantasy is not nothing. It is, of course, not a tangible object, but it is a fact, nevertheless. It is, say, a form of energy, despite the fact we can't measure it. It is a manifestation of something. And that is a reality that is just a reality as, for instance, the peace treaty of Versailles or something like that. Yeah. It is no more, you can't show it. But it has been a fact. And so the psychical events are facts, are realities. And when you observe the stream of images within, you observe an aspect of the world.
And